The chamber of the verdant accord had not gone silent in 11,000 years. It was silent now. Ambassador Rel Kion of the Thessary Dominion stood frozen mid-sentence, his 4 eye stalks trembling, his translator drive sparking uselessly against his collar. Around him, 17 species representing 43 star systems stared at the small, unarmed, unremarkable human standing alone at the center of the vast obsidian floor. She had just refused an ultimatum backed by 3 battle fleets, 3 words. That was all she gave them, guards along the chamber's edge. Armored things with plated hides and weapons drawn from 100 conquered worlds. Didn't move. They were waiting for a signal that never came. Because their masters didn't know what to do either. Grand Speaker Evith Koran, eldest of the council, and the being who had personally overseen the subjugation of 9 civilizations, leaned forward on her throne of fused crystal. Her voice, when it finally came, was not angry. It was something far more dangerous. "Say that again," she whispered, so the recorders capture it properly. The human, Colonel Mira Chen, 41 years old, formerly of the Pan-Earth Defense Corps, now the last free representative of a species the council had already sentenced, did not blink. "We refuse," she said. The chamber erupted. But none of this had begun that way. 3 days earlier, Earth had received its first message from beyond the solar system. It wasn't a greeting, it was a bill. The transmission arrived simultaneously in every language spoken on the planet, translated with unsettling precision by technology no human engineer could explain. The message came from an entity calling itself the Verdant Accord, a coalition that, according to its own declaration, had been quietly cataloging Earth for over 2 centuries. The terms were simple. Humanity would surrender 90% of its heavy industry, all orbital manufacturing rights, and every child born with what the Accord scanners classified as high cognitive potential, to be raised and educated within Accord territory for the betterment of galactic society. In exchange, humanity would be permitted to exist, not thrive. Exist. The world's governments convened within 6 hours. Military command staff filled underground bunkers, built during a Cold War that had ended before most of them were born. Scientists pored over the transmission's technical fingerprint, trying to determine the Accord's true capabilities. Everyone reached the same grim conclusion. They had no way to fight what was coming, and the Accord fleet, 3 warships the size of small moons, was already 3 days out from Earth orbit. Colonel Mira Chen had not expected to be in that room. She had spent the last decade running disaster response for the International Crisis Authority, coordinating relief after earthquakes, famines, and the slow bleeding wounds of climate collapse. She had buried more people than she'd saved, and she carried every one of them somewhere behind her eyes. When the Secretary General asked for a volunteer to meet the Accord delegation, someone willing to walk into a negotiation that might end with a single word erasing a city, the room went quiet. Mira raised her hand. "Why you?" the Secretary General asked, not unkindly. "Because I've already looked at the worst thing that can happen to people," she said. And I didn't look away. Nobody in that room understood yet what kind of answer that truly was. The shuttle that carried her up was Accord-built, sent down specifically to retrieve her. Sleek, silent, and disturbingly comfortable. Mira spent the ascent studying every detail she could, cataloging weaknesses out of pure habit, though she suspected there weren't many to find. She was met in orbit by an escort of Thessary officers, tall reptilian beings with cautious, calculating movements. Their leader, a mid-ranking officer named Dral, studied her the way a biologist studies an unfamiliar insect. "You are smaller than projected," Dral said. "You'll find we're full of surprises," Mira answered. That wasn't even the strangest exchange of the journey. During the 4-day transit to the Council's home station, Mira noticed something the Accord clearly hadn't accounted for. Their crew was exhausted. Not physically, biologically, most species aboard could function for weeks without rest, but something deeper. Every officer she spoke to carried a particular weariness in their voice, a careful flatness that suggested they were choosing their words with the caution of people who had learned that opinions could be dangerous. She asked Dral about it once, quietly, in a corridor with no visible cameras. "How long has the Accord been the only power in this region?" she asked. Dral's eye stalks lowered slightly. "Since before my grandmother's grandmother was born. And in that time," Mira said, "has anyone ever told them no?" Dral didn't answer, but something shifted behind his eyes, the flicker of a question he'd never let himself ask aloud. Nobody knew what the human was really doing. Not yet. Not even Mira herself, not fully. She was gathering something more valuable than any weapon. Understanding. The council station was a marvel, a construct larger than Earth's moon. Built from the harvested remains of 3 worlds the Accord had integrated over the centuries. Mira walked its corridors under guard, past murals depicting glorious unification that, on closer inspection, always seemed to omit exactly how that unification had been achieved. She met privately, before the formal hearing, with a Vacaran diplomat named Sarai, one of the few species on the council still permitted a seat, though barely. Sarai's people had resisted the Accord 3 generations ago. They had lost. The scars of that loss were written into every careful, deferential word Sarai spoke. Do not refuse them outright, Sarai warned her, voice low. I have seen refusal before. It does not end in negotiation. It ends in demonstration. Demonstration of what? Sarai's throat sassed, an expression Mira had learned meant deep unease. Of what happens to those who forget their place. The council chamber's mistake was already forming, though none of them could see it yet. They had spent 2 centuries perfecting the art of demanding submission. They had never once had to argue for it. Mira thanked Sarai for the warning. Then she walked into the hearing anyway. The Grand Speaker's opening address lasted nearly 40 minutes. Mira listened to all of it. The recitation of Accord benevolence, the careful legal language dressing conquest as charity, the thinly veiled threat wrapped around every promise of protection. When it was her turn, she didn't recite prepared remarks. She'd burned those on the shuttle ride, quite literally, using them to test whether Accord fire suppression systems would trigger. They had. That told her something too. You've been doing this a long time, Mira said instead, looking directly at the Grand Speaker. Cataloging worlds. Weighing what they're worth. Deciding what they owe you simply for existing where you found them. We have brought stability to 43 systems, Ivith Koran said. Order. Prosperity. You brought silence, Mira said. I've been on this station 3 days. I've counted how many species speak freely in front of your guards, and how many don't. It isn't 43. Murmurs rippled across the chamber. The truth stunned more than a few of the seated delegates, because most of them had never heard it said aloud, in this room, to the Grand Speaker's face. Ivith's crystal throne caught the light as she leaned forward. You test my patience, Colonel. I'm not testing anything, Mira said. I'm answering your demand. The chamber fell into the silence it had not known in 11,000 years. We refuse, she said. What followed was not war. It was worse and better than anyone expected. The Grand Speaker ordered the fleet at Earth to begin what the Accord called demonstration protocols. A controlled bombardment, meant to show the cost of defiance without full annihilation. A lesson written in fire on an uninhabited stretch of Australian coastline. But Earth's answer arrived first, not a weapon. A broadcast. Every scrap of footage humanity's disaster responders, journalists, and ordinary citizens had gathered over the previous 72 hours, compiled and transmitted directly into the Accord's own communication network by hackers who'd spent 3 sleepless days reverse engineering alien code out of pure desperation. Earth showed the council chamber, and every listening species behind it, exactly who they were choosing to erase. Teachers evacuating classrooms under threat of orbital fire. Strangers pulling strangers from collapsed buildings, parents holding children and refusing, even now, even facing annihilation, to hand them to anyone. It wasn't propaganda. It wasn't defiance dressed as strength. It was simply true. And the truth, transmitted into a network built on centuries of curated silence, broke something the Accord had never anticipated. Sarai's people rose first, quietly, then not quietly at all, then 2 more delegations, then 5. Dral, still in orbit above Earth, refused the order to fire. The Grand Speaker had made a terrible mistake, and she was the last to realize it. She had spent 2 centuries teaching the galaxy that resistance was impossible. She had never taught it what resistance looked like, until 3 words, spoken by an unarmed woman from an insignificant world, gave 43 systems permission to remember they had a voice. The Accord did not fall in a day or a year. Empires built on silence rarely collapse all at once. They crack slowly, from the inside, as more and more voices refuse to stay quiet. But it began in that chamber, on that day, with 3 words that traveled farther than any fleet ever could. Mira Chen returned to Earth 6 months later, older in ways that had nothing to do with time. She never called herself a hero. She never claimed the credit history would eventually give her. When asked, years afterward, what she had been thinking in that silent chamber, facing beings who could have erased her world with a gesture, she gave the same answer she always gave. I wasn't thinking about dying, she said. I was thinking about everyone who never got the chance to say no. The 3 words that shook the universe were never a boast, and they were never a threat. They were a promise, the kind only the willing can make, and only the free can keep. We refuse.